So what's next? No, seriously, that's the name of the next panel. They wrote that joke for me. I was like, I'm going to use that. I think that's all right. I think that's going to work. So the panels. So now what? So now what? The post-election outcome. Again, as she mentioned, I'm Chandler Morse. I'm a board member for the forum, and obviously, as previously mentioned, was with Senator Flake for a long time working on immigration. So these issues are near and dear to my heart, and I lead corporate affairs at Workday. And so now we heard a little bit of this conversation in the previous panels because I think it's a natural question now. So we'll dive deeper into what's going to happen next. I'm really excited to hear these leaders share their insights, both kind of what's around the next corner with Congress. If you're new to DC, it's actually literally around the corner, like it's like right there. So figuratively and literally what's around the corner, and then after a long campaign with lots of comments about immigration. So without further ado, we have Robert Jones, who is CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. And you can come on down and take your seat as we do this. We have Pastor Walter Kim, president of the National Association of Evangelicals. We have Kristie De Pena, and I made sure I knew how to nail that last part, senior vice president and director of immigration policy at the Niskanen Center. And our moderator will be Jeff Brumley, reporter and editor from the Baptist Global News. And so with that, please take it away.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Glad you're all here. Thank you, by the way, to the forum for inviting me to do this. Welcome to OK, Now What, right? The post-election outlook. The format's going to be about 30 minutes of our speakers speaking, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A towards the end. It'll be 2 or 3 questions that will be handed to me at some point. The topics we're going to cover will include what the outcome of the election tells us about voters' attitudes about immigration, about the impact that could have on policy, and the rhetoric and cultural views around immigration. But before we begin, Robert has a slide presentation on his research into the 2024 election. Robert? Great.
All right, good morning. Oh, come on. Thank you. All right, so I'm a Baptist from the South, so I'm going to hear a little more talk back here. So I'm going to take you through some data looking at, I know we've all been staring at exit polls and, every piece of data we can find, but I'm really going to focus on just a couple of questions that kind of give us a sense of the pattern. I'm going to apologize ahead of time because I think the slides, when they get translated, the font's all shrunk, but I'll slow it down and kind of talk you through the patterns here, and happy to make these slides. These slides are public. They are from PRI's American Values Survey that we released at the Brookings Institution just before the election. So happy, the slides are actually available on PRI's website. Happy to make this particular slide deck available as well. But I'll kind of walk through some slides here, and I will just make sure I kind of talk through the patterns. You'll probably be able to see the patterns certainly over there. You will not be able to see the fonts, but I'll kind of explain what we're looking at. So the first thing here, see how small they are, is critical issues for voting. What people told us as they were heading down the home stretch of the election, what did they tell us were the most important issues to their vote? And so these are the top 6 issues that both Republicans and Democrats told us were the most important issues to their vote. I put up here the first ones are Democrats. And so at the top of the thing, health of our democracy, increasing costs of housing and everyday expenses. We're here to talk today about immigration. That is the one down on the bottom among Democrats, right? So only 24% of Democrats said that immigration was a critical issue to their vote this year. It was like way down the list here. When you look at Republicans, you will see a dramatic difference, right, here. And what we see is that immigration was neck and neck with the increasing cost of housing and everyday expenses. Like, it was the top issue, really, driving vote going into the election. And that's, by the way, is nearly a 50-point gap between Republicans and Democrats on the salience of immigration to their vote in this election cycle. So that was just absolutely huge. By the way, the other one to kind of watch out for here is abortion, which other kind of salient issue in the election. It was 55% of Democrats who said abortion was a critical issue. Only 29% of Republicans said abortion was a critical issue. So if you're looking at the gap between the Republicans who say abortion versus immigration, again, it is 40 points. Only 29% of Republicans said abortion was a critical issue. 71% said immigration was a critical issue. So that was absolutely the driving thing this election cycle. To show you just how much this shifted, again, I'll kind of explain what we're looking at here. Just in this election cycle compared to just the last one. On the left here, I've got, this is abortion and immigration here. And this is, again, comparing 2020 and 2024. In 2020, if we look at the kind of ratio between who said abortion versus immigration was a critical issue, in 2020, abortion outranked immigration among Republicans. And it did so by more than 10 points, right? So in 2020, 49% of Republicans said abortion was a critical issue. Only 38% said immigration was a critical issue. And then I've already given you the number this year, but you could just see the difference. This is 2024 on the right, 2020 on the left, right? So the salience of immigration just between 2020 and 2024 among Republicans jumped from 38% to 71%, just between the last election cycle and this one. So that tells you how much it jumped up in terms of salience. The next thing I want to talk about here is we asked a different way. I'm just going to give this to you quickly about kind of the litmus test issue. So not just was it critical, but would you not vote for a candidate that disagreed with you on this issue? So kind of a more harder question. We see the exact same pattern here. So among Republicans in this last election cycle, the ones who said they would only vote for a candidate who shares their views on immigration was 59%. Among Republicans. Like it was just that was like litmus test issue. Only 36% said they would only vote for a candidate who shared their views on abortion, right? So it far outranked, even as a litmus test issue. Among Democrats, we saw actually the mirror opposite, right? Only 23% of Democrats said they wouldn't vote for a candidate who disagreed with them on immigration, but 56% of Democrats said that about abortion. Right, so that's a kind of mirror image that we're seeing in this particular election cycle. I'm going to just skip that in the interest of time. Here's the other thing. So we go to policy. So I'm going to show you kind of two questions, one on policy and one on views of immigrants themselves, right, to kind of give you a sense of kind of where we are. So we've been asking at PRI about immigration policy ever since our inception. So we got 15 years of data on immigration policy. This first one I'm going to show you is the gap between 2013, or the changes between 2013 and 2024 by party. And we ask a three-way question about what to do about immigrants who are living in the country illegally right now. It has three options. Allow them a path to become citizens, allow them to become legal residents but not citizens, or identify and deport them. All right, so what I'm going to show you is the top answer. The percent who favor allowing them to become citizens provided they meet certain requirements. That's the way the question is phrased. So here we are, and this is going to be, again, the last 11 years of data. This represents, by the way, over 200,000 interviews that we've conducted over the last 11 years. So each of these sample sizes is quite large here, and this is what we see. Right, so you'll notice that the top line is the line for Democrats. It started off at 71% back in 2013. Support for a path to citizenship. It is 77% today. It's gone up a little bit, but it's relatively similar. You see independents have remained steady, but have dropped off. They were 64% in 2013. They're 55%. Supporting a pathway to citizenship. But the real difference here is the shift in Republicans over this time period. So back in 2013, we actually had a bipartisan consensus on a path to citizenship, right? Even 53% of Republicans favored a path to citizenship for immigrants living in the country illegally today. That number kind of stays around the same actually until the end of 2019. Then it begins to drop, and it just fell off a cliff in the last year. So it's down to 36%. That's the last number down here. Another way of thinking about this is that the partisan gap on this question in 2013 was 53% to 71%, right? It was 18 percentage points. It has more than doubled in that last thing. So now we're looking at a 41% gap between the two political parties on this question. So this is just a very, very different world we're living in than even 10 years ago. So that's like one really important piece of this puzzle. The other thing I want to show you here is this is where groups by religious affiliation are. I know you can't read the labels here, but let me kind of lay it out for you here. That what we find here is that, again, this, let me make sure this is right. Yeah, path to citizenship. That what we find here is that this is the 2013 numbers here. Again, in 2013, if you look across the religious landscape, every religious group in the country was a majority support for a path to citizenship. So white evangelicals down here at the bottom were the lowest group, but even then 56% supported a path to citizenship for immigrants living in the country illegally. Here are the numbers today. So the green numbers, you can just see they're all, have all dropped. Across the board. Now, they dropped across the board, some smaller than others, but the biggest drop by far are white evangelical Protestants on the bottom here. They went from 56% down to 40% supporting a path to citizenship. So that's a 16-point drop. Compare that, to African-American Protestants, only 3-point drop. Latino Catholics, this is a 7-point drop. So this is a big, big drop. There's no other group that dropped that much. And in fact, today, we still have every religious group except white evangelicals in majority support for a path to citizenship. They're the only group that has dropped below majority support for that policy. So that's policy. I want to ask about a view of immigrants in the country. And I just want to I can't resist or feel the need to kind of say something quickly personal here. There are a number of questions as a social scientist that I found myself having to ask that I never thought I would have to ask. And this is one of them. And I can't tell you how depressed it made me to have to ask this question and seriously put this on a public opinion survey to see what Americans thought. And the question was whether you agree or disagree that immigrants entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country. But that has become part of our national reckoning, our national dialogue today. So we ask this question. It turns out that this is the All-Americans number here. It's 1 in 3 Americans, about a third of Americans who agree with that statement today. There's a gigantic partisan gap on this question. The partisan gap on this is nearly 50 points. So it's 6 in 10 Republicans. That's 61% of Republicans, only 13% of Democrats. Independents look like the country, 3 in 10 independents here. And then here is the religious landscape on this question. And it won't be that surprising. There's only one group that is in majority support. That's white evangelical Protestants. They look exactly like Republicans. 6 in 10 say that they agree with that statement. Among white Catholics, they're essentially divided. It's about half. 46% of white Catholics are also there. Then it drops. Then basically every other group is about a third or less in the religious landscape. But among white Catholics and white evangelical Protestants, there's a majority. Among white Catholics, it's a divide on this thing. I want to say one more quick thing about evangelical identity. And we've got Walter Kim here, and we talked about the kind of diversity of evangelicals. So most of the time on these charts and most other social science charts, you'll see it's white evangelical Protestant, right? That's how we kind of identify in the religious landscape. But as we know, there are many people who are not white who also identify as evangelical. So I want to kind of just give you that context here. Among all Americans, if you don't sort by race, it's actually 4 in 10 Americans who identify as either evangelical or born again. If you just ask kind of the population that question, about 6 in 10 say they do not. And even though we mostly refer to white evangelicals when we're doing kind of social science analysis, the group that has more evangelicals, the racial group, are African Americans. In fact, a majority of African Americans identify as evangelical or born again. It's 56% of African Americans. Among whites, it's 37% overall that identify as evangelical or born again among whites. And among Latinos, it's 1 in 3 who identify as evangelical or born again. So kind of that's the context for where we are. However, I want to kind of put that into context and look at this other question here, and then I'll wrap it up with this, about this question about whether immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. And you can see the differences that kind of racial and ethnic identity, when they're married to evangelical identity, make here. So the first kind of slides I have here are non-evangelical or born-again groups by race here. And this is how many people agree that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. Among whites, it's 40% of non-evangelicals who believe immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. Among Latinos, it's only 24%. Among African Americans, it's only 16%, again, of non-evangelicals. Here is the, and I'll give you the corresponding numbers among those who identify as evangelical in each of those groups. And you'll see the jump, right? So among whites, again, who identify as evangelical, it's 59%, all right, who agree with that. Among Latinos, it's 35%. Among African Americans, it's 22%. So what ends up happening here is that among whites, there's about a 22%, or about a 20% gap. That is, that those who identify as evangelical are about 20 percentage points more likely than whites who do not identify as evangelical to agree with that statement. That immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. Among Latinos, it's about 11 points that evangelical Latinos are higher than non-evangelical Latinos. Among African Americans, it's 6 points, and in fact, that is not statistically significant, that gap between so there's actually no statistically significant difference, but only among African Americans. So I'm going to stop with that and just kind of close by saying this. So if I'm thinking about what's the most salient thing here that we're dealing with and the new normal that we have here is that we are seeing, one, this huge partisan gone from a consensus to a nearly 40-point gap, right, between partisans on the issue, on the issue of policy. And then I think the other thing, and the only other way to say it, is that this kind of really what is a racist and hate-filled conception of immigrants has really taken hold with a significant minority of the population and with one particular segment of the religious landscape. And that's a problem we're going to have to continue to deal with as we kind of wrestle with both policy and the treatment of immigrants in the nation going forward. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Robert. That's a lot to digest there. Wow. I want to start with Walter, if I could. You saw the slides on pathways to citizenship and poisoning the blood and so forth, and how those measured out with evangelicals. Is that jive, or is that in keeping with what you know about evangelicals? Could you let us know what you think about that?
Question. And Robert, thank you for the research that you're doing and what you put forward. Clearly as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, after that presentation, there's just a lot to process, right? And there's a little bit of an irony, because if you haven't noticed, I'm not white. But I'm also the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. My own personal narrative is one that speaks to what I think is a seed of hope and possibility here. And that is, as the son of a refugee and immigrant parents who came in the 60s to America, I grew up in New York City, but then moved to a small coal mining town for the bulk of kind of late elementary, middle school years. And in this small town in the foothills of Western Pennsylvania Appalachian Mountains, I was probably the only Asian that anyone had ever seen in life. But it was in that context, the son of an immigrant from a metropolitan area, where a white conservative Baptist evangelical had befriended me and introduced me to such a winsome expression of Christian faith that I became a Christian at that point. There's, I think, a disjunction between oftentimes the human individual interactions that people of faith would have and the public policy discourse that is more on the abstract level, which is why evangelical ministries all throughout our country are actually on the front lines of refugee resettlement. World Relief is the humanitarian arm of the NAE and one of the refugee resettlement agencies of our country. All throughout the country, you'll go into different neighborhoods, and churches, evangelical churches, are profoundly engaged in their communities with the idea of building bridges in the name of Jesus. And yet, there are these public policy disjunctions that exist that need to be embraced. I think that speaks to the complexity and I would say even convoluted nature of the ways that people hold their beliefs, engage in personal relationships, and then in more abstract ways engage with public policy, or perhaps disengage their personal experiences with their public engagements, which raises the question of the possibility of building upon the personal, which is often so compelling in the ways that we connect with one another, and to drive what begins with the personal to reorder the public commitments. But even there in the public commitments, the evangelical perspective becomes complicated because many of our evangelical denominations are on the cusp or on the way of becoming majority-minority. So this is not an abstract issue when you think about evangelical denominations, that it's on the realm of public policy. This is an issue that church denominations, these affiliations of churches, have to deal with the immigrant churches that are rising in their midst. So I'll give you an example of that. I used to pastor for 20 years in Boston. Very post-Christian part of the country. The American Bible Society deemed it one of the least engaged, Bible-engaged regions of our country. So it's the place where churches go to die, you would think, right? But between 1965 and 2015, the number of churches in Boston actually doubled from 300 to 600. This is not because of church splits, and this is not because of population increase. Actually, there was a very great dip in population in Boston, then a resurgence. So the population was about the same between 1965 and 2015. Yet the number of churches doubled. Most of them were immigrant churches. And most of the immigrant churches were evangelical churches. And this is the reality that many of our denominations within NAE has to deal with. And I think this explains when you test and ask a different set of questions. Earlier, Lifeway research arm of the Southern Baptist, did a set of studies polling on 6 principles that the Evangelical Immigration Table, of which the NAE is a part, advocates. And these 6 principles include respect of the God-given dignity of every person. 91% of evangelicals affirm that. Not just, we have to branch out from the white evangelical, the broader. Protect the unity of the immediate family, something of a pro-life issue, 91%. Respect the rule of law, 93%. Secure national borders, 91%. Ensure fairness of taxpayers, 93%. And establish a path toward legal status and/or citizenship for those who qualify and who wish to become permanent residents. Even among evangelicals, 75%. Now, this was released earlier in the year before our election cycle really took hold and changed the national discourse on immigration. My hope is, and this is not merely a hope in the abstract, it's a hope of a person that has actually experienced a country of deep hospitality and a church of deep hospitality, also predicated on the work of many evangelical organizations that, despite the public discourse about evangelicalism, are in their communities engaged deeply in this work of bridge building between communities. My hope is that the discourse that we've experienced is something of an aberration that needs to be combated rather than a feature that needs to be uprooted. If it is a feature that needs to be uprooted, then of course there's deep soul searching within the evangelical community. But I think personal stories, as well as statistics that cut the issue in different ways, gives me some hope that what now, we actually have something to build upon.
Thank you, Walter. I'd like to ask Kristie 2 questions. One, the first one is, take all that information that Robbie shared. How's that going to translate into policy given the outcome of the election? And then I'll follow up after that.
Sure. So, of course, there are things that we are going to need to learn and digest and take away from this election. That's going to be probably a many years long process in thinking about how we approach policy moving forward. But one of the things that I think Walter highlighted is that, there does need to be a better sense of community in thinking about the way that we talk about policy and we communicate immigration policy in particular with people across the nation. And the forum does this really well with some of their outreach through law enforcement and through businesses and through faith. But we do need to have more messengers that are talking about immigration policy in a more informed way and in a trusted way. That said, I think that's about where the hope ends. When we're looking at what the American people at large have said, it's that they are very much in support of a lot of the policies that candidate Trump was talking about over the course of the last year and a half, and that many of the policies that we as sort of policy experts and advocates in this space know are going to be sort of wildly detrimental to our economy and certainly devastating to families in our society are things that by and large the American people support right now. And so we really need to think through how we are going to grapple with that in the very immediate future while sort of digesting all of the things that we need to learn from the election results.
Okay, great. And the follow-up to that is, to what extent is it fair to say that President Biden has laid the groundwork in some of his policies on immigration that may help Trump institute his things?
Yeah, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. On one side, the fact that the Biden administration really implemented a lot of pretty serious changes to the asylum process over the course of this year has meant that border numbers, by and large, are lower. We expect those trends to probably continue through the lame duck session. And that will, I think, give President Trump a little bit of space at the outset of his first 100 days to get all the money that they need through reconciliation and move all of the policies that we know President Trump will move by way of the things that he did in the last administration and, of course, the policies that were laid out in Project 2025. And I want to emphasize that although the president had took great pains to distance himself in many ways from Project 2025, the last iteration of that very document really did take hold during his first presidency. And so when you see his first term implement about 70% of the things that we saw in the Heritage Foundation document way back then, just within the first year, it's pretty clear that we can anticipate that we're going to see a lot of those Project 2025 policies implemented pretty quickly in this administration. And of course, some of the strongholds that we had last time, which were, lawsuits and financing of some of those goals, have been greatly reduced in power and potency this time around. And, looking at the way that this next administration plans to implement a lot of these changes, I think that it will go relatively smoothly. And I think the opposite side of that coin, very briefly, is that there's been a big backlash to the number of people that came in through legal pathways, and in particular, CHNV. And by virtue of that program, I think that will be something that gives Trump a really early and easy win by cutting off that program, of course, but also limiting parole authority moving forward.
Thank you. Robert, you mentioned in your presentation the declining support for pathways to citizenship among different groups, especially white evangelicals and Republicans. And I mean, what happened over the last 11 years? How do you explain, in an elevator speech maybe, what happened?
Trump. Mm-hmm. I need one syllable. Leadership matters. And we've had, so what's been going on the last 10 years, right? 2015, Trump enters our national politics. 2016, he takes over the Republican Party. And this has been the drumbeat, right, for 10 years. And I think for many people who are people of faith, right, we take discipleship and character formation seriously, right? And when you feed yourself a diet of that kind of rhetoric, we also heard it from Fox News over and over and over again. You can see it in the data. When you look at Republicans, just take a party thing. If you look at Republicans who say they most trust Fox News to give them accurate information about current events and politics, that's the way we ask the question. Who do you most trust? And you give a whole bunch of television news outlets. Republicans who trust Fox News are 20, 30 percentage points more likely to hold anti-immigrant attitudes. They're more likely to agree with this poisoning the blood of the country statement. They're more likely to agree, by the way, with, we also have a question in this last survey about setting up militarized encampments, rounding up immigrants and setting up militarized encampments. Trump, by the way, cited the Enemy Aliens Act, right, which is the act that we set up Japanese internment camps in this country under. He's already cited that act as basis for what he's planning to do. So I think we can't mince words here. I mean, this is, when you have this leadership and this kind of rhetoric from a major network, from a leading candidate of one of our two political parties, that's the whole answer to why we're here.
Walter, how important is it going to be for evangelical leaders to speak up and set an example at this time? And I also, just part B of that is there a tension between them and their grassroots at this time?
Yeah. I think it's absolutely essential that evangelical leaders speak up on this issue because it's not merely about the issue of justice in our country, the character of our country. Robbie, you mentioned something about discipleship and formation. To me, it's an issue of the formation of people who claim Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And the flip side of it is the malformation of people's faith. So I think there's a theological reason. If we, as Christians, seek to be more Christ-like, we have a Savior, speaking from a Christian tradition, who introduced himself into the world by this passage in the Gospel of Luke. The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the oppressed, sight for the blind, release for the captives. So there's fundamentally something that is going to be deformed in the life of a Christian if we do not address these issues. There's something un-Christ-like in the discourse of our country and in the belief structures and practices, increasingly, of people who claim faith in Christ. So I think there's a deep theological reason. There's a practical reason. I've already cited this. This is not an abstract theological debate about what did Jesus really emphasize. The landscape of American Christianity is undergoing one of its most massive transformations ever. And we need to encompass the reality that this discourse is not about an other outside of the church community. It is, in fact, the transformation of the actual church community. So if we are to love our brothers and sisters who share this faith, this is not an issue that we could relegate to politics. And the final thing that I would add is, as Christians, we have a place of goodwill in the country. Again, referring back to my tradition, there's Prophet Jeremiah who exhorted the people of God to be a blessing to the city, to pray for its flourishing. So I think there's theological reasons, I think there are practical reasons, but I also think there's an engagement in politics reasons for the church to be involved in this. And that is, what does it mean to see the place that we live flourish? And we've already heard of economic reasons for this, social reasons for this, and I would argue deeply human reasons that we need to be engaged in this issue because it leads to flourishing of communities.
Thank you. We do have our Q&As, but I got to ask Kristie one more question. How much can the incoming administration implement without congressional participation? How far can they go with the things they want to do? In theory, if Congress didn't have anything to do with it at all.
It's a good question, and I really wanted to leave this on a high note, but I won't. The roadmap has been public, it has been clear, and really that roadmap is based on this premise that, last time there was a lot of chaos around the Trump administration. There were people in and out of cabinet positions. We may see that again. This time, this effort is infinitely more planned. It has been thought through extensively, and it is extraordinarily complex and comprehensive. And what they have created is basically a way to use changes to processes, bureaucracy, guidelines, the movement of personnel, how they're going to tackle staffing agencies in an otherwise quite brilliant way. And it is going to, piece by piece, really undermine how every single aspect of immigration functions in this country, and eventually won't function in this country. And if we're going to look for a silver lining, and I do look for them often, we did see an incredible rebuilding of the refugee resettlement structure after the first Trump administration in a way that was infinitely more efficient and effective than we have seen in decades, which was sort of a beautiful change that we got to see as a result of it, being brought down to nothing. And I think my hope is, and hopefully this is reflected in some of the polling and the attitudes towards immigrants that we see that are positive, is that folks will be really invested in that rebuilding of state capacity, as we sort of move past this initial deportation, close the border, cut off legal immigration, no more refugee resettlement, which I do think is coming, but there will be that opportunity to rebuild. And so thinking about what rebuilding looks like is an incredibly important, if not maybe the most important thing that we can do, that is parallel to, of course, all of the efforts that everybody's going to take to sort of minimize the impacts of a lot of these changes to immigration.
Thank you. All right, we have questions from the audience. We have 3 here that I've been given. They're all excellent. I'm going to start with, and maybe Robert, you can take this one. How do we address some of the concerns and fears of those who oppose immigration? Are facts and figures helpful, or do we need to change strategies?
Yeah, well, I think Walter, hinted at part of this. We see the patterns actually when people have contact with immigrants, their attitudes are much more positive in the country. And in fact, like we see this, we sort states, but the most anti-immigrant attitudes aren't the border states, right, in the country, right? And despite the fact that policies often seem more draconian in those states, but in public opinion, I think that's not true. And so I think it has to do with, we saw this with LGBTQ rights as well. People who know someone who's gay or lesbian, much more likely to have more positive views. And that kind of personal connection, I think, does make a huge difference. The other thing to remember is that this idea of like rounding up people, putting them in encampments, that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, it is not where most of the country is. I think that's the other thing to remember, right? That we still have a majority of the country, despite this kind of drop off in one party, we still have a majority supporting a path to citizenship. We still have 6 in 10, almost 2/3 saying, no, I disagree with that. And let's remember, like that poisoning the blood of the country, that's Nazi language, right? That's not partisan, that's Nazi language, straight out of Mein Kampf, right? And we have 2/3 of the country that's saying no. And I think part of it's going to depend on us finding our voices and saying this collective no to that, right? Whatever we disagree with that policy, right? But no to that, because that way lies, a country I don't recognize.
Thank you. This one is for Walter. Are there differences in attitudes towards immigrants among evangelicals when considering frequency of church attendance? And I might just add to that, if you're a white evangelical and you go to church with Hispanic people who are evangelicals, does that make a difference? Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I think Robbie pointing out this issue and kind of highlighting it, when you humanize problems, you begin to change attitudes, right? It's not enough just to throw a bunch of good arguments and statistics. Anyone who's tried to raise children will understand that. So this notion of humanizing, bringing relational proximity between communities is incredibly important. But even that I don't think is sufficient, because bringing relational proximity will not always lead to the kind of honest discourse of what a community is actually experiencing. So we need to give a permission structure to communities that are being impacted by this discourse to say, if you are my friend or a fellow congregant, we can't just sing songs about Jesus. We have to have honest discourse about how this is actually impacting me and my community, the fears that are being produced, the anxiety, the hope as well, that someone would stand in solidarity with our community. Those things become absolutely essential. But it is also the case that, depending on where you are in the country, you can be increasingly in an isolated, self-contained echo chamber. And that is part of a larger cultural problem that we're encountering, the segmentation of our society, both geographically but ideologically. And so bringing that relational proximity becomes increasingly difficult. And then bringing ideological, honest conversation becomes even more difficult because of this self-sorting that we're going through. And it's not just the problem about immigration. It is a problem that's confronting our society as a whole. And that larger cultural phenomena is going to be extraordinarily challenging for us.
Thank you. This is another one for Robert. Are we likely to see public opinion become more supportive of pro-immigration policies in response to possible overreaches from President Trump? And I guess the way I interpret that is, if he gets mean enough, will people feel sorry for what they did and be more supportive of humane immigration policies?
That's a good question.
I don't know. To be honest, I wish I could say yes. I went back and looked at public opinion. I mentioned the Japanese internment camp in the 1940s. We may, most of us know that happened, but that went on for 4 years in our country. And I went back and looked at some public opinion data from 1942. 93% of the country approved of FDR's decision. It rounded up 110,000 plus people of Japanese descent, some German descent as well, and others. 93% said that. And even when they asked follow-up questions about, okay, the people who've been removed and moved into the interior, do you think they should ever be allowed to come back? And it was half of them who said, not only almost like 93% said, yes, this is a good policy, and half of them said, no, they should never be able to return. Right, and these were citizens, many of them, right? Not just people in the country legally with citizenship. So I don't know. It took us a while. It was not until the 1980s, I think, that we formally got around to rescinding the order, right? That was responsible for this. And so we've had some very ugly moments in our country before, and so I think the answer is going to be like what people in this room decide to do in the next 4 years is going to be the answer to that question.
Thank you. Well, looks like we are getting close to being out of time. I want to thank everybody for being here, and thank you to the forum for inviting me to moderate this panel.